He is known around the world as the Iron Dictator who ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist. However, history books seldom mention the darker side that lies behind the propaganda, sculptures, and powerful image. We will explore the worst aspects of a leader who was both adored and feared in this video. Rephrase Stalin and his ruthless laws. It is fair to see Joseph Stalin as the creator, not the successor. He was born in Gori, Georgia, on December 18, 1878. The nation was once a member of the Russian Empire. His given name at birth was not Joseph Stalin, but rather a lengthy and intricate one, Lozep Bazarionis Chivali. His mother was a pious lady who wanted Stalin to be a priest, but his alcoholic father frequently mistreated him. But fortune had other ideas. Stalin displayed rebellious skill at a young age. He was expelled from seminary school for promoting prohibited Marxist ideas. He transformed into a whole new man after that. Following his departure from school, Stalin devoted himself entirely to underground revolutionary work. Among other things, his responsibilities included orchestrating rallies, stealing money from banks to support the party, and disseminating propaganda. He was repeatedly taken into custody and banished to Siberia. However, his determination just grew stronger, not weaker. He changed his name to Stalin, which means man of steel, right here. Stalin joined the new administration following the success of the Russian Revolution in 1917. In contrast to other revolutionaries who were skilled at speaking, Stalin was silent, uncharismatic, but might be characterized as extremely ruthless and cunning. Stalin was given a weak post by Vladimir Lenin, the head of the revolution at the time, in 1922, Secretary General of the Communist Party. Like today's equivalent, it was primarily an administrative role. However, this is where his brilliant cunning really shows through. Second, creating a database. Stalin utilized this administrative position to put his supporters in important positions all over the nation. He gathered every bit of knowledge he could about his competitors' sins and foes. Stalin was eventually seen to be a threat by Lenin as he got older. It is correct. He even drafted a will that warned against Stalin, but Stalin was able to keep the letter under wraps. Following Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin began to behave as though he were in a battle for the throne. Through lies, exile, and clandestine executions, he methodically eliminated each of his opponents. Stalin had established complete control over the Soviet Union by 1928. He quickly initiated the ambitious 5-year plan to transform the Soviet Union from a low-income agrarian society into a major industrial powerhouse. To accelerate the nation's industrialization, Stalin's plan set ambitious goals for boosting the output of coal, grain, steel, and heavy machinery.
However, he clearly required a lot of food and money to support this venture. Where did he get it? By stealing it from his own folks. The state compelled all peasants, particularly those in a little better position, to surrender their land, livestock, and implements. What would happen if they declined? They were branded as enemies of the nation before being arrested, imprisoned in labor camps, or even executed. Over 100,000 farmers were exiled to faraway places like Siberia in 1929 alone. However, it's worth mentioning that rural farmers revolted. They chose to murder their livestock rather than hand it over to the government. Food output declined considerably therefore. However, did Stalin care? No. He grew even harsher and dispatched troops to take the remaining grain from the granaries of the peasantry. Consider this. It was thought that in the first 2 years of this time, around 10 million farmers lost their land or houses. Additionally, the number of farm animals decreased by half, and the nation's food stocks got even more depleted. Isn't that insane? However, Ukraine experienced the worst of all these oppressive laws. In a tragedy known as the Holodomor, millions of people starved between 1932 and 1933. The term Holodomor is derived from Holoda, which means starvation, and Mority, which means killing. Therefore, it signifies killing by hunger. This wasn't just a famine brought on by poor harvests. It was a deliberate starvation imposed by the administration of Joseph Stalin. He confiscated all the people's grain to fund his industrial initiatives. But why Ukraine and no other country? Ukraine served as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union.
To aid industrialization and export, Stalin sought every bit of grain from Ukraine. Despite a terrible crop in 1932, Stalin nonetheless compelled farmers to hand over their whole harvest. He went so far as to dispatch special forces to confiscate everything, including the final kernel of wheat that was concealed in people's dwellings. Anybody caught stealing any grain, even from a field, may face immediate gunfire. You're asking yourself, why didn't folks just flee? All borders were closed. Anyone who tried to flee would be shot, and nobody could get away. Millions of people endured great suffering because of this harsh law. People were compelled to eat whatever they could because there was no food left. They consumed grass, tree bark, leaves, and even cooked pebbles. To obtain a piece of bread, many people sold their apparel and jewelry. Cannibalism began to rise along with the deterioration of the situation. It was genuine. Just to live, many people consumed their relatives after cooking them. It is thought that between 3.9 and 7 million people starved to death during that period. The issue is that the Soviet government was attempting to rewrite history history, so they kept the media and other nations in the dark about it. For this reason, the outside world was unaware. It took decades for information and documents about Holodomor to be made public, even after Joseph Stalin's death. After millions of deaths, do you think Stalin would have calmed down? No way. Indeed, he grew even more paranoid and began a new chapter in his reign of terror, which came to be known as the Great Purge. The unexpected killing of Sergei Kirov, a well-liked politician, served as the catalyst. Many people believe that Stalin orchestrated the murder himself to justify the execution of anyone he perceived as a threat. Yes, anybody was susceptible, including party members, military officers, professors, doctors, scientists, authors, and laborers. Stalin basically made up new regulations that gave the NKVD, or secret police, the power to arrest and kill anybody without trial or proof. This is when the actual version of the horror game Among Us begins. The Soviet Union was extremely ruthless. Those accused of being traitors would be seized in the middle of the night and subjected to severe torture until they confessed. The issue is that they had to admit they were traitors, even if they hadn't done anything. They would either be put to death or imprisoned in the Gulag if they admitted their guilt, without going through any judicial procedure. Millions of people were sent to the Gulag, and about 700,000 were put to death over the course of 2 years, between 1936 and 1938. Since you've already heard of the term Gulag, I'll describe how the system of mandatory labor functioned. Life in these camps was the punishment for those fortunate enough to avoid execution. These camps were situated in far-off parts of the Soviet Union, such as Siberia and the Urals. The Gulag is not your typical jail. The tasks aren't merely basic, like being an administrator. People work 16 hours a day. In temperatures as low as -50 degrees Celsius, they mine for coal, smash rocks, or chop down trees. They only receive 1 meal per day, which is not enough. They receive only hard bread and thin soup, thus they don't eat delicious foods like veggies. There is no medication available to those who are ill. They just die if they pass away. It's horrible. This has happened to over 18 million individuals, including instructors, physicians, farmers, and even kids. It's disorganized. However, in 1939, when Stalin was preoccupied with abusing his own populace, he came up with a ridiculous scheme. He struck a secret agreement with his greatest foe, Adolf Hitler. It was a peace treaty on the surface, but they decided to divide Eastern Europe. Hitler invaded Poland from the west several days after that. From the east, Stalin invaded Poland 17 days after. The slaughter took place in. Stalin executed 22,000 Polish officers to get rid of any opposition. However, Hitler was also plotting to stab Stalin in the back. As a result, Hitler launched a surprise strike against the Soviet Union in 1941. Prior to this, Stalin had been quite self-assured, but he was taken aback and remained in hiding for a few days. He was even more ruthless when he emerged again. To stop the Nazis from using them, he instructed his men to set fire to every town and demolish bridges. The citizens of the Soviet Union were the ones who endured the most of the pain. They were left without food and housing. He also established a regulation stating that any Soviet soldier attempting to flee would be shot in the back by his own comrades. The worst aspect was that he called whole ethnic groups, such the Chechens and Crimean Tatars, traitors. Tens of thousands of people were forcibly deported to Siberia, where about half of them died along the way. Stalin was still furious even after World War II.